Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. I'm joined today by Bob Carr, head of the Australia-China Relations Institute at the University of Technology in Sydney and former Foreign Minister of Australia. Mr. Carr has a long experience with China, both in and out of government, and today we'll take the opportunity to catch up with him about the relations between our two countries, particularly with regard to recent developments in the South China Sea and the latest national elections. But before we begin our discussion, let's look at this.
Bob Carr was born in a Sydney suburb in 1947 and became interested in politics in his teenage years. Mr. Carr was first elected to office in 1983. Within 5 years, he assumed the leadership of New South Wales Labour Party after former leader and Premier Barry Unsworth lost the 1988 election. Carr became Premier of New South Wales in 1995. Former New South Wales Labour Premier Neville Wran described Bob Carr as the very model of a modern Labour Premier and a template for other Australian Labour Party leaders. But by 2004, after nearly a decade as Premier, polling showed public support for Mr. Carr falling. He announced his resignation as Premier and member for Maroubra on July 27, 2005. In 2012, Carr joined the Australian Senate and became Minister for Foreign Affairs, replacing Kevin Rudd. He held that office until his resignation in October 2013. In 2014, he accepted the directorship of the newly formed Australia-China Relations Institute of the University of Technology, Sydney, a think tank devoted to studying and enhancing the relationship between China and Australia.
Welcome to Dialogue, sir.
Pleasure to be with you.
Bob, on a number of occasions we've been discussing issues concerning China-Australia relations. But from your point of view, what are the most important issues or events since we last spoke?
Australia is a sort of case study in bilateral relations with China. Australia is an American ally, sees itself as part of the West. So this new phenomenon of a powerful and economically prosperous China is a challenge to Australia. But it was very interesting to see Australia choose to join the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, sponsored by China, despite a US president ringing our then Prime Minister and asking him not to. It's been very interesting to see Australia stand back from calls by 2 US admirals to have Australia join patrols in the South China Sea that enter the 12 nautical mile radius of Chinese claimed territory. And it's been very interesting to see Australia not choose Japanese, but to go for French submarines in making a commitment on our submarine defence over the next 40 years. So these are straws in the wind, but I think off the back of the free trade agreement that has been settled since we were last talking, it shows that Australia is rising to the challenge of dealing with the new China that is such a force in the world.
But how difficult is it to handle this relationship with China, which is emerging as the second biggest economy, and the alleged threat in the South China Sea?
Well, put it this way, Australia, we're always urged to understand China by reference to its history. And so people like me plunge into what happened during the Tang dynasty and earlier, look at what happened during the Qing, the early Qing. Let's take a similar approach to understanding Australia and its attitude towards China. Australia was for years a happy part of the British Empire. And then post-1945, after being threatened with invasion by Japan, Australia became part of the US alliance system. And then it had the huge benefit of an economic relationship with Japan. None of these challenges to think more broadly like the thing we've got going for us now with China. China's huge, it has different political values, it's becoming an important regional power, it's entrenched its position as an important regional power on its way to being a world power, but so different from our previous relationships. The British Empire, the Americans, the Japanese. And I think I think Australia almost deserves to be looked at by Chinese think tanks in a case study of how it might be done. And I think it's been done pretty successfully. But I find Chinese interlocutors often say, as you seem to say, why should it be too hard anyway?
Why don't you suggest that Australia could also play a very constructive role in bringing America and China together on thorny issues like the South China Sea, particularly following the latest verdict, quote-unquote, of the arbitral tribunal?
Yeah, I hope my successor as Foreign Minister in the Conservative government in Australia, Julie Bishop, I hope she's doing that behind the scenes, using diplomacy. I think America has seen that Australia simply doesn't want to join American patrols or run patrols like those that America has run on 3 occasions now in the South China Sea. And the implicit message to the United States, and Australians think fondly of the United States, although our fondness is tempered by severe anxiety about what a Trump presidency would mean. I think the message Australia is giving to America is that many of your allies value their relationship with China. And because America gets anxious about dominance and power and leadership in the Asian region, doesn't mean that a country like Australia, or for that matter South Korea, New Zealand, you can think of other examples, is going to burn its relationship with China to impress Washington.
But we have received the conflicting claims and the statements and the messages from Australia since the release of the results of the arbitral tribunal in The Hague. For example, the shadow defense minister of Australia went as far as to suggest that you should also join patrols in the 12 nautical miles of the Chinese territory in the South China Sea.
Yeah.
To what degree, but of course this claim was immediately confronted by the foreign minister. Is this part of your domestic politics, or what the shadow defense minister suggested represents a very strong voice from the other side across the aisle?
I don't think it can be invested with too much meaning. The leader of the opposition, Bill Shorten, the leader of the opposition Labor Party, who did very well in the recent Australian elections, has not endorsed the statement by his shadow defence minister. And it was firmly rebutted by Prime Minister Turnbull, I think very correctly, and by his Foreign Minister Julie Bishop. The tribunal determination has just come down. China and the United States have been very cautious in their response to it. It would be altogether adventurism for Australia in this climate to suddenly say we're going to start running patrols like those of the Americans. And I think it was healthy. I think it was healthy to see the Prime Minister and Julie Bishop rule it out, and the opposition leader himself to sort of cautiously pour cold water, if I could put it that way, on the suggestion. So I think, look, on the bottom line, Australia has not mimicked those American patrols. 2 US admirals gave speeches or interviews suggesting it might be appropriate for Australia to do it. But that put Australia in the position that if it had followed the Americans, it would have looked like we were doing it in response to suggestions by US admirals. Nothing would have cast Australia more perfectly as deputy sheriff to the United States in the region. I think the significant thing for America and China to absorb is that Australia has not done that. And if we take the comments of the Prime Minister in the last 24 hours seriously, Australia is not going to do that, and nor should Australia. My advice as a former Foreign Minister and head of a think tank devoted to Australia-China relations is that there must be diplomacy here. There must be diplomacy. And there have been hints from Chinese media and reports out of the Philippines that Rodrigo Duarte, the new president of the Philippines, entertains the ideal entertains the idea of a deal with China.
Let's look at the latest editorial of Financial Times, which was posted on the Chinese website here, and many people can get easy access to this article. This article says, in between the two extremes across the broad spectrum of, between the two extremes of A, the so-called Permanent Court of International Arbitration and gunboat policy would be nothing. There should be nothing in between. However, part of the Oriental tradition or Chinese tradition has always been to have negotiations outside the court. We are very reluctant to go to court on issues such as territorial disputes. It's not part of Chinese culture to do that. But this editorial suggests strongly that there's no alternative to this dilemma. What do you think of the functions and the importance of diplomacy? Do you think we have exhausted diplomacy at this moment? And what do you think of the implications of brinksmanship?
Well, if one thinks about the opportunities for diplomacy here, there are two tasks. One is to continue to do what the sides have been doing, America and China, for example, which is to manage their operations in the region to minimize the chance of conflict through miscalculation or accident. So, quietly, without addressing the fundamental disagreements, America and China, I understand, have been working at the better management of their coexistence as powers in the region. The second challenge is to explore things that have been hinted at, the prospect of resource sharing agreements. Resource sharing agreements with the Philippines and China, for example, setting aside the debate over sovereignty and saying we've got a resource here that can be developed with the proceeds being split. And let's look at one side or the other going in and developing the resource, the other side marketing the resource. There are, I think, 4 precedents in Southeast Asia of countries putting aside the dispute over sovereignty and getting on with developing the resource to what the Chinese would say would be a win-win position. So they're the two areas where an outsider, an Australian, would hope negotiations would be better management of the dispute while it remains unresolved, and second, exploring an ultimate resolution that may lie in the area of joint development of the resources and seeing the sea as vast enough to benefit all its peoples, as has been the case historically.
Bob, we appreciate your indication of a silver lining even of the darkest clouds following the release of the verdict from The Hague. Do you think the ruling from The Hague is every bit counterproductive, and China, there is a strong and robust rebound of nationalist sentiment in the streets of Beijing, and on the WeChat you can see everywhere people have been talking about our rebound, our punishment, our reprisals, so on and so forth. I'd like to have your take about, whether China should show more of its intransigence, or what should be a more constructive approach on the Chinese side in the wake of The Hague?
Well, as someone who wishes China well, I would caution China against any coercive moves anywhere in the South China Sea in response to this ruling.
But the United States prefers to lead by example, but it's not a party to UNCLOS. Neither is it to ICC or
no, I understand, Ray,
Kyoto stuff.
I understand the point you're making, which might be expressed in a different way, and that is that the United States needs to be careful about talking about the international liberal order and the rule of law. Because I could add to your list of telling examples the invasion of Iraq in March 2003.
We're going to talk about the inquiry report.
Yeah, that's interesting. Of course, without a resolution of the UN Security Council, and therefore an invasion that had no status, no standing in international law. But the coalition was marshalled and it went in, and the world is living with the consequences. ISIS, unloosed on the world as a result of the displacement of the Sunnis by that horrifically miscalculated Western intervention under the leadership of George W. Bush in Iraq. So America has got to be somewhat careful about invoking a steadfast commitment to international law and a rules-based system when its own record suggests that on many occasions it has departed from those standards because its national interest urged it to do it. But I would strongly urge, as a friend of China, to think carefully, to consider the importance of relations in Southeast Asia to fulfilment of China's destiny, to think of ways of tending to relationships with smaller nations as China fulfills itself in its destiny to become a great power. I think a lot of us have got an image of China that could be affected, could be diminished by any action that seems ill thought out or dedicated to stepped up militarisation. I'd urge America to be cautious too.
Thank you very much. You are watching Dialogue with Mr. Bob Carr, former Australian Foreign Minister and currently head of a think tank which is working for betterment of the Australian-China relationship. We'll be back in a short while. Please stay with us. Welcome back, sir. Let's take a look at the ramifications of the Chirkut report, the inquiry report about the wrongdoing of former Prime Minister Tony Blair. Similarly, Mr. Paul Barrett, who headed Australia's Defence Department from 1998 to 1999, has called for a similar inquiry in Australia on the basis that in the wake of the failed intervention in Iraq, the UK had strengthened the checks and balances of the country's decision to go to war, adopting the practice of a debate in the House of Commons over the decision to commit troops. Australia did not have a similar mechanism. How likely or desirable would you consider that proposal to be taken up?
Yeah, I don't know whether an inquiry into the hugely mistaken decision by Australia to join the United States in that invasion would produce much. I think we know what happened. It was fundamentally a decision, a mistaken decision by the then Prime Minister John Howard, a very, very bad decision. And it reflected a view that you get in some quarters in Australia that our role in international policy is to be the best possible ally of the United States and even being with America when America is wrong. The view I would take, and a view I think a majority of Australians would take, is that while we're committed to an alliance relationship with the US, we should be prepared quite strongly to tell Americans when we disagree. That's a more mature relationship. I don't think an inquiry much in Australia, but I think given the enthusiasm with which Tony Blair made this, I suppose, a defining element of his prime ministership, the enthusiasm with which he committed an army of occupation to Iraq, that Chilcot inquiry was entirely justified, and I hope the lessons of it are properly learnt. And it's not only British families who lost sons or husbands in the desert who had a right to that inquiry, but I think all the British people who wondered why their Prime Minister of the day was snuggling up so close to an American president very few British could identify with.
The primacy of the United States would not have been achieved without the strong support of the allies, both in Europe and in the Asia-Pacific region. Tony Blair is licking his wounds, but he refused to genuinely apologize, despite the inquiry report. Now, the transatlantic relationship is put aside for a while. Let's look at the impact of the Brexit. Now, Prime Minister David Cameron has left number 10 of Downing Street, and he's been replaced by Prime Minister Theresa May. What do you think of the impact of the leadership change in London? Will that deliver a blow to the future of the European Union?
No, I think the new Prime Minister has been very interesting in her choice of rhetoric in the last couple of days. She's talking about controls on the salaries of top executives. She's talking about action to make housing more affordable. It's going to be very hard to resolve that, given the rapid level of immigration. I think the biggest lesson she's got to learn is that the British people don't want uncontrolled levels of migration. But she's using different language. This is a Conservative Party leader who's listening to the message that Brexit was all about. We think the economy is being run for a few. The majority of people don't benefit, and you haven't been listening to us about matters like high levels of immigration that depress wages and don't benefit the British population. So I think it's very interesting to see that she's laid down a few indicators of taking a different path, almost as if she's listened not just to Brexit, but to the messages coming out of the Trump insurgency in the United States.
President Obama has called for the stay proposal. He raised the stay proposal asking the UK to be part of the European Union. Unfortunately, it was a disappointment for many of the elites who designed the future of the European Union decades ago. So do you think a UK that cannot leverage resources, namely relationship with continental Europe as strongly as before, would be a weaker partner of the United States? Because since the invasion of Malvinas, or in British words, Falkland Islands, in the early 1980s, people started to see special relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom. But do you think without strong membership of the European Union, a UK would remain a strong and firm ally of the United States? Now, I'm raising this issue in the context of perhaps weakened leadership of the United States, since I said earlier that the primacy of the United States leadership would not be made possible without the strong commitments of its allies, either in Europe or in the Asia-Pacific region.
Yeah, I think it's impossible to answer that question. The UK still has a big defence budget, one of the biggest in the world. It has a big overseas development assistance budget, overseas aid. I think it responds to a tradition of the UK being present, but there's no doubt that America in recent years has already seen Britain not making as grand a contribution as it once did. And I think that there's been a view in Washington for some years now that the special relationship doesn't amount to so much these days. Doesn't amount. It was sort of when you had George W. Bush and Tony Blair at one in sponsoring the invasion of Iraq. But since then it's been in retreat.
Well, foreign policy is one thing. Let's look at the domestic politics, and an important part of that would be the role of Australian Chinese. We see an increasing number of Chinese immigrating to your country, and they become part of the electorate and part of the Australian democracy. However, it's long been a tradition of Chinese not to participate actively in politics. They are keen on making money. We are not proud of this part of the tradition, but it's been true that most of the overseas Chinese are not willingly involved in the process of political participation. Is that the same case in your country?
No, I don't think it is. I don't think it is. When on our election day, Saturday, July 2nd, I toured polling booths in 3 electorates. I noticed in 2 of them a very big Chinese presence. There was, on one polling booth, working for the Liberal Party, working for the Conservative Party, was a young Chinese man who told me he'd been in the country 4 months, but he'd been recruited by friends to go there and stand on a polling booth and hand out how to vote Liberal, how to vote cards. Now, I think both sides of politics are very concerned that the Chinese vote matters, They have election material in Chinese. They have Mandarin-speaking volunteers who make phone calls in Chinese. And a number of Chinese are becoming very prominent. And now you're seeing Chinese candidates in local government, in state government, and at the national level. I think Australian politicians would think that the Chinese community is as politically involved as any of the great migrant communities that make up multicultural Australia.
The last question, Bob, is what are your thoughts about having a strong lobby group from the Chinese community in your country? They may not be as interested in political participation as in, doing business, but Australia-China relationship matters so much for them, for their business and for their cohesion as part of Australian society. So what do you think of this lobby?
Well, they are as entitled as any other migrant community to say the bilateral relationship between our new country, the country we've adopted, Australia, and the country we came from, is important to us. And I think we'll see them saying that increasingly. And I think they'd expect Australian leaders to have a positive and optimistic view of the Australia-China relationship, and they would expect that Chinese investment in Australia would not be demonised, but they'd also expect, I think, that it would be in Australia's interests. I've got no worries about this community integrating, but I also think we can expect them to have a keen interest on how China is dealt with by Australia and the relationship being kept in that realm of positive and optimistic. It's a very happy migrant experience. I think one of the wonders of recent Australia, that the Chinese population has grown so rapidly, China now being our biggest source of migrants.
Thank you very much. That's our dialogue with Mr. Bob Carr, former Australian Foreign Minister. We've been talking about our bilateral relationship and particularly the latest developments in the South China Sea, because Australia is one of the closest allies of the United States. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.